Darius Bell had spent 2 decades building his tech empire from the ground up. No silver spoon, no powerful connections, just relentless work. When the Morning Exchange, one of the nation's biggest talk shows, invited him for an interview, he knew the game. They wanted a headline, a narrative, a spectacle. But what he didn't expect was the trap they had set for him. On live television, the host subtly questioned his success, hinting that his achievements were not earned but handed to him. But Darius was no pawn in their game. His response? It sent shockwaves across America. And once the cameras rolled, there was no turning back. The email arrived in the late afternoon, short, formal, and to the point. The Morning Exchange, one of the most watched talk shows in the country, wanted Darius Bell, CEO of Innovis, as a guest for their upcoming segment on diversity in business. On the surface, it seemed like a golden opportunity, national exposure, a chance to showcase his company's groundbreaking technology. But Darius had seen this play before. The media had a habit of spotlighting Black entrepreneurs only when it suited them, parading them as symbols of progress before swiftly moving on. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the email, his instincts buzzing with unease. His assistant, Tasha, noticed the way his fingers drummed against the desk. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, arms crossed. "You know how these shows work. They build you up just to tear you down." Darius exhaled, rubbing his chin. "I know, but this is the Morning Exchange. Millions of viewers. If I don't show up, they control the narrative without me." Tasha shook her head. "I just don't want them twisting things. You know they're going to bring up the contract." She didn't have to say which one. Everyone in the industry knew. Innovis had just landed a $200 million defense contract, outbidding legacy firms that had dominated the space for generations. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a handout. It was the result of 2 decades of relentless work, building an encryption system so advanced that even the government couldn't ignore it. And yet, the whispers had already begun. Some claimed Innovis had won because of diversity quotas, that agencies were choosing optics over quality. They couldn't believe a Black entrepreneur had simply outperformed the competition. Darius met Tasha's gaze. "Let them bring it up. I'll handle it." She sighed, clearly unconvinced. "Just don't let them bait you." Darius smirked. They're playing chess with the wrong man. The morning of the interview, he arrived at the KXNT studios in Los Angeles. The air in the green room was cool, sterile, devoid of warmth. A young producer, barely looking up from her clipboard, greeted him. "Mr. Bell, we'll mic you up in 5. No small talk, no effort to make him feel comfortable. Just in and out, like a transaction." As he sat in the makeup chair, an assistant dusted powder across his face with detached efficiency. A monitor on the wall displayed the live broadcast, celebrity scandals, a cooking demo, and then a transition card flashed across the screen. Coming up next, the Black tech boom, talent, or special treatment. Darius clenched his jaw. So, this was their angle. He had been invited under the guise of celebrating his success. But in reality, they were questioning it, framing his achievement as something to be debated. If he had been any other CEO, one with the right connections, the right pedigree, no one would ask if he had earned his place. A quiet laugh escaped him. If they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a surprise. The stage was set, and the game was about to begin. The set of the Morning Exchange was designed to feel inviting. Soft blues, warm golds, a sleek glass coffee table reflecting the bright studio lights. But beneath the polished exterior, cameras hovered like silent observers, capturing every movement, every reaction. Darius adjusted his suit jacket as he took his seat across from Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor. She was a seasoned journalist, known for her smooth yet piercing style, a master at making people comfortable before cutting them down. She greeted him with a practiced smile, one that never quite reached her eyes. "Darius Bell," she said, her voice as polished as the set around her. CEO of Innovis, a true American success story. Darius gave a polite nod. Appreciate you having me. She leaned in slightly, flipping through her cue cards. Let's get right into it. Your company recently secured a $200 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech. That's impressive. Darius knew this tactic. Build him up first. Make it seem like they respected his achievements, then find a way to tear him down. He kept his response measured. It was a long process, but yeah, we put in the work. We developed a security encryption system that outperformed our competitors. Simple as that. Madeline crossed her legs, tilting her head just slightly. Some have called it groundbreaking, she said, before letting a pause stretch just a little too long. But others have raised questions. Darius didn't flinch. Questions? She picked up a card, reading aloud as if relaying an objective fact. Some industry experts say Innovis benefited from federal diversity incentives, that agencies are actively looking to diversify their vendors, that perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota. There it was. The real reason he was here, not to discuss his technology, not to highlight his leadership, but to justify his success. Darius let a beat pass before he responded. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. I've heard that argument before. It's funny though. When a black entrepreneur wins, it's called special treatment. But when a legacy firm, run by the same families for generations, lands those same deals, no one questions it. A shift in the air. Off camera, the producers exchanged glances. The control room stayed silent. Madeline held her ground. So you're saying race played no role at all in your success? Darius chuckled, shaking his head. Let me ask you this. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos landed government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me? Madeline's expression barely flickered, but something in her eyes sharpened. She wasn't done. She had more to play. Do you believe these diversity programs help? She pressed. Darius folded his hands, leaning back slightly. They help level the playing field, but what people don't realize is the playing field was never level to begin with. She nodded, as if considering his words, but Darius knew better. She wasn't listening. She was setting up her next move. Let's talk about that playing field, she said, her tone shifting just slightly, no longer just curious, but calculated. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Single mother, public school, no Ivy League degree. And yet, here you are, securing contracts over billion-dollar corporations. That's inspiring. Darius gave a slow nod, already sensing where she was going. Madeline continued, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to cast doubt. But some might wonder, how does someone with no family connections, no elite background, go from a struggling neighborhood to outbidding corporate giants? She didn't need to say it out loud. The implication was clear. How did you get here? Did someone pull strings? Darius tilted his head slightly, considering his words carefully. Then, without hesitation, he answered, It's called work, Madeline. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on, so we build from the ground up. She gave a small nod, like she was hearing him. But she wasn't. She leaned forward just slightly. But surely, you had help along the way. Maybe a mentor, a program, something that gave you an extra push. Darius exhaled quietly. Yeah, help came in the form of working 3 jobs while getting my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent. The studio went still. The producers behind the cameras were locked in now. Madeline shuffled her cue cards again, her polished expression never faltering. But Darius saw it. The small pause, the slightest flicker in her eyes. She had expected defense. What she got was truth. And for the first time, the weight of that truth started shifting the room. Madeline's smile sharpened. Smooth, practiced, but with an edge beneath the surface. She had played her first two cards, and Darius had parried with ease. But now, she was ready to push harder. She set her cue cards down deliberately, tilting, her head just slightly. "Well, Darius," she said, her tone shifting. "Let's talk about opportunity. Some would argue that Black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. Programs like affirmative action, minority business, grants, and government incentives exist specifically to open doors that weren't open decades ago." She let the words linger, then pressed forward. "So would you say that your success proves the system isn't as stacked against Black entrepreneurs as people claim?" Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, locking eyes with her. His voice was measured, controlled, but it carried the weight of every barrier, every denial, every battle he had fought to get here. "You know what's funny?" he said, his tone calm but unwavering. "When a Black business owner succeeds, people always ask what programs helped us, but nobody asks which old money bank funded a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family. Connections got them into Stanford. Nobody asks which golf buddy invested in their company." He let the words settle for a second before delivering the next blow. "The truth is, success isn't handed out in some lottery. People like me had to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table." A noticeable shift in the room. The mass producers, the camera crew, they all felt it. But Madeline wasn't done yet. She straightened slightly, turning just enough toward the camera, as if shifting the conversation to a broader audience. "That's an interesting perspective," she said smoothly. "But let's talk about perception. You present yourself as a self-made success, but some critics argue that Black entrepreneurs often receive more media attention than their white counterparts. That the story of overcoming struggle is more marketable than the thousands of white business owners who work just as hard but don't get the same headlines." Darius let out a quiet chuckle, not of amusement, but of disbelief. "Oh, so now we get too much attention." Madeline kept her poised smile, but there was a small shift, a tension in her posture, a flicker in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to laugh. "You're telling me," Darius continued, his voice steady, "that in a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where major tech funding overwhelmingly goes to white-owned startups, the real issue is that people like me get too much press?" Madeline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers moving just a little too quickly. "I'm just pointing out," she said carefully, "that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit." Darius exhaled, shaking his head. "Merit," he said, almost to himself. He glanced briefly at the cameras, then back at her. And then he dropped the hammer. "Let me ask you something, Madeline. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now?" Her lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, he kept going. "You think I got here because I played the diversity card? Or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out?" The silence in the studio was deafening. Madeline's face remained composed, but her fingers curled slightly over her cue cards. "Off camera." A producer muttered something under his breath. They all knew this wasn't just another interview anymore. Madeline cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "I think it's fair to say you're passionate about this, and I respect that," she said. "But let me ask you something, Darius." He gave a slight nod, waiting. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. Then, in a tone that was calculated, deliberate, she said, "Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated?" Darius stilled, The question hung in the air like a slow-moving blade. Madeline continued, her voice smooth. After all, your success proves that the system isn't as unfair as some claim. The audacity. Darius could feel the heat creeping up his spine. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. And then, he ended the debate in one sentence. You know, he said, voice calm. It's funny how people love to use one success story as proof that a problem doesn't exist. Madeline's smile wavered, just for a fraction of a second. Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. And then, he drove it home. Let me put it this way. If one person escapes a burning building, do you point at them and say, "See, the fire wasn't that bad"? The entire studio went still. Madeline opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it. Even the crew had stopped moving. Darius wasn't done. The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken. It just means I fought twice as hard to get through it. Another silence. But this one was different. It wasn't discomfort anymore. It was impact. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if the weight of Darius's words had settled into every corner of the studio. No one spoke. No one moved. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to keep rolling or cut, away from the raw, undeniable truth hanging in the air. Madeline shifted in her seat, reaching for a controlled response. She turned slightly toward the cameras, her voice adopting that carefully neutral tone used for damage control. I understand your perspective, Darius, but let's talk about another side of this. Darius watched her, waiting. He could see it now. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her cue cards just a little too tightly. She had walked into this interview expecting to challenge him, but now she was trying to recover. Some might say, she continued, that your frustration isn't really about race, that it's about resentment toward larger corporations. After all, you've publicly criticized big tech companies for not hiring more diverse executives. Darius tilted his head slightly. Resentment, he repeated, his voice carrying a quiet edge. No. Accountability? Absolutely. Madeline pressed her lips together for a brief second, as if recalibrating her approach. Then, with that same polished smile, she delivered what she thought was her final blow. Then, what do you say? She asked. To those who believe that in today's economy, success is based on hard work, not race, Darius exhaled through his nose, then locked eyes with her. This was it. The moment that would define the entire interview. I say, he began, voice steady, that people love to believe in fairy tales when they're the ones benefiting from them. The impact of those words rippled through the studio like a shockwave. Madeline's expression remained composed, but something in her eyes flickered, just for a second. The producers off-camera shifted uneasily. Someone in the control room muttered a curse under their breath. But Darius wasn't done. Let's be real, he continued, his voice calm but unshakable. Black entrepreneurs still get denied loans at twice the rate of white business owners. We still receive less than 2% of venture capital funding. And even when we prove ourselves, even when we outperform the competition, we still get asked if we deserved our success. Madeline sat still, listening but not necessarily hearing. So let's stop pretending the system isn't rigged, Darius said. It is. And the only people who don't see it are the ones it works for. Silence. Pure. Heavy. Silence. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The control room didn't intervene. This was raw, unfiltered, and unstoppable. Madeline cleared her throat, glancing briefly at the off-camera producers. But there was no rescue coming. She had walked into this, and now she had to sit in it. Darius adjusted his watch, letting the silence stretch, just enough to make people squirm. Then, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. You know what the real problem is? He said, quieter now, but somehow heavier. Madeline hesitated. What? Darius didn't blink. The bar isn't in the same place for everyone. She shifted slightly, as if buying time. Meaning? I mean, Darius said, a mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country. But a brilliant black man has to jump through flaming hoops just to get a shot. A producer off camera cursed under their breath. They knew. This was going viral. Darius kept going. A white CEO can run a company into the ground, bankrupt it, lay off thousands of employees, and somehow still get hired somewhere else. Meanwhile, a black CEO has one bad quarter, and suddenly it's proof that we weren't ready for leadership. Madeline opened her mouth to respond, but she had nothing. Darius let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. And the best part? He said, voice dripping with bitter irony. When we actually make it, people like you sit across from us and ask if we got here because of some special advantage. Another silence, but this one was different. This wasn't just a moment of discomfort. This was a reckoning. Madeline's jaw tightened. It was subtle, but the camera caught it. Darius leaned forward just slightly. Not aggressive. Just firm. Just final. You wanted to talk about fairness? He asked. Then he let out a soft, knowing chuckle. Then let's start by telling the truth. Madeline's expression had shifted. The power in the room had shifted. It wasn't just the audience watching Darius now. It was the entire country. The interview ended, but the battle was just beginning. The moment the cameras cut, the tension in the studio didn't break. It deepened. Producers stood frozen, hands hovering over their earpieces. Madeline sat still, gripping her cue cards, just a little too tightly. No forced smiles, no easy transition. She knew what had just happened. Darius adjusted his suit jacket, glanced at her one last time, and stood. He had said what needed to be said. Now, it was out of his hands. By the time he walked out of the studio and into his car, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, texts, notifications flooding his screen like an unstoppable wave. He unlocked it, and the first thing he saw was a Twitter post. A clip of the interview, already going viral. Darius Bell just exposed the media's bias on live TV. This was powerful. Truth hurts. Darius Bell. Another tweet, already at $50,000, likes in under an hour. The way he looked into the camera and called out America, chills. Darius scrolled, watching the firestorm spread in real time. Some people called him a hero. Others called him arrogant and combative. He just told the truth they don't want to hear. Here we go again. Another guy pretending to be oppressed. Cry me a river. This is why people don't like hiring activists. Play the race card all you want, but hard work speaks louder. Darius let out a slow breath. He had expected backlash, but this was bigger than he anticipated. Cable news picked up the clip within the hour. Some praised him, calling his words a much-needed conversation on race and success in America. Others labeled him angry, divisive, entitled. By lunchtime, the Morning Exchange released a carefully worded statement. We value open dialogue and diverse perspectives. While today's discussion became more intense than expected, we stand by our commitment to fair conversations. Darius laughed when he read it. Fair, right? That's what they were calling it now? His assistant, Tasha, called, her voice half laughing, half exasperated. Do you realize you just set the internet on fire? Darius rubbed his temple. Wasn't exactly my plan. Well, congrats, she said. You just became the most talked about entrepreneur in America. But not everyone saw it that way. Some clients pulled out. A major corporate partner suddenly decided to reevaluate their commitments. Darius expected that. He had seen this before. What he wasn't expecting was the threats. Emails, phone calls, Even an unmarked package left outside Innovis headquarters. Inside, a single sheet of paper with one word written in bold. Enough. Tasha frowned as she read the message. You need security. Darius let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He knew this would come. Every time a black man spoke too boldly, too unapologetically. This was the cost, but backing down was never an option. And now, he had a decision to make. Would he let the backlash silence him? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger? The next morning, his office was flooded with calls, not just from reporters, but from investors. Tasha sat across from him, scrolling through emails. You know, she said, we just got a flood of new investor inquiries. People want to work with us. Darius smirked. Let me guess. The same people who ignored us last year. Tasha shrugged. Guess being controversial is good for business. But it wasn't all positive. The hate mail kept coming. Anonymous threats. Corporate partners distancing themselves. Then, a new twist. Tasha walked into his office, her expression unreadable. We just got an offer. Darius raised an eyebrow. From who? She set a folder on his desk. A network. They want you to do a televised special, a one-on-one deep dive about race, business, and the system. Darius exhaled. So now, they want to listen. Tasha smirked. Seems like it. Then, after a beat, she asked, What do you want to do? Darius leaned back in his chair, thinking. He could walk away, let the noise die down, get back to business. Or he could use this moment, not for clout, not for attention, but to say the things nobody wanted to hear. He picked up the folder, flipping through the proposal. Then, he set it down. He looked at Tasha. Tell them I'll do it. Her eyes widened slightly. You sure? He nodded. Yeah, but on my terms. Because if the system was going to put him under a spotlight, he was damn sure going to control the narrative. Darius Bell's interview wasn't just another viral moment. It was a reckoning. A conversation people had dodged for decades was now front and center, forcing America to confront the uncomfortable truth about race, success, and the systems that decide who rises without question and who gets questioned when they rise. Some called him an activist. Some called him arrogant. Some called him right. But one thing was certain. Nobody could ignore him anymore. As he prepared for his televised special, Darius knew this wasn't about proving himself anymore. He had already done that. This was about rewriting the rules. So now, the question wasn't about whether he belonged at the table. The question was, what would he do with the microphone in his hand? And that was up to him. What do you think? Does success mean playing by the rules of a broken system, or does it mean rewriting the rules entirely? Let us know in the comments. If you believe more stories like this need to be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because conversations like this, they don't just happen. We make them happen. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And remember, the system only changes when we refuse to stay silent.